I do want to officially welcome you to Why Should We Read Ismail Kadare? I'm Carrie White. I'm your host for this week's festival events. And if you haven't checked out the virtual festival bookstore, you can also access that through the conference website. Here you'll be able to purchase several Kadare titles with proceeds helping support local independent bookstores. And with that, I will hand things over to Emily.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I am so delighted to welcome all of you to the panel, Why Should We Read Ismail Kadare? We have four fabulous panelists here today to talk with us about Kadare's work. It would be great if you could each give us a wave when I read your names. Professor Ani Kokobobo, Professor Fabrice Conte-Williamson, Professor David Bellos, and Professor Peter Constantine. All have translated major work by Cadare and can speak to his importance as scholars. Fabrice Conte-Williamson is also a theatrical director and will bring that perspective to the discussion. Now, I really want to make sure that we have ample time for discussion for the audience today. So I'm going to try and keep my introductory comments as brief as possible. But I really do want to pause and say a word of thanks to the members of the Neustadt family who are in attendance today for their role in creating and sustaining the Neustadt program, which has had such a huge impact on both faculty and students at the University of Oklahoma. As the faculty person leading the Neustadt seminar this fall, I am particularly aware of everything that this program achieves. Over the last 2 months, my students and I have read 6 major works by Cadare and have had the chance to visit on Zoom with many festival participants, including all the scholars featured on this panel. I am very grateful to everyone who took the time to speak with my students about Cadare's fiction, Balkan culture, and the art of translation. And I am grateful to the Neustadt family and WLT for creating this amazing program, which gives OU students a front row seat and backstage access to an amazing literary festival. And frankly, this year, thanks to Zoom, this is one way in which we are all gaining, because we are all getting backstage access with the chat features. We are all getting front row seats, and it's a wonderful thing. So we are gathered here today to discuss one of Eastern Europe's most acclaimed writers. Since his early novel, The General of the Dead Army, appeared in French translation in 1970, Cadare has been recognized around the world as an important literary voice. In his novels, he speaks, often elusively, to the contradictions, banality, and horror of life in communist Albania, and ingeniously reworks elements drawn from indigenous Albanian folklore, Balkan history, and Greek myth, integrating these into fictional worlds that are at once artistically convincing and very original. Our plan for the panel is as follows. Our 4 panelists will each speak briefly about Cadare's work. I'm going to introduce each panelist before he or she speaks. Then I may kick off the discussion with a question if we have time, and then I'll throw it open to audience questions. I think you've already heard from Carrie all the information about how to submit a question. Just feel free to pop those into the chat at any time, preferably with the word question in front of them in all capitals. If it's a question to a specific panelist, be sure to say question Ani or question Fabrice, right? And then put in your question. That'll make it easier for us to spot your questions in the chat. With that said, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Ani Kokobobo is an associate professor and chair of Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Kansas and the editor of Tolstoy Studies Journal. She received her PhD from Columbia University with a dissertation on the grotesque and the body in late Russian realism. She specializes in 19th century Russian literature as well as in Balkan modernism, right? She recently translated Cadare's essays on world literature, which appeared in 2018 with Restless Books. She is going to speak today, as I understand it, partly about Cadare's perceptions of Cadare in Albanian culture. Ani?
Let me unmute myself. Okay. Sorry, I'm audible. Thank you so much for the invitation, Daniel. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Emily. I'm grateful to the Neustadt family for putting this event together and for honoring an Albanian author. As I understand it, I'm going first because I'm the only Albanian of the panel. So you know, there's a lot that's Albanian about Kadare's art. And I won't necessarily focus on the Albanian perceptions, but obviously I'll touch on it. You know, Kadare grounds many of his novels in Albanian history, culture, and myth, capturing a wealth of experiences that would otherwise, that would otherwise be unseen and unaccounted for in the West. To give some examples, we have Chronicle in Stone, where we have Kadare capture his hometown of Gjirokastra, and the peculiar neighborhood culture that emerges in that tiny little world. We have Broken April, where again, he takes us through highland Albania with its blood vengeance and medieval law codes, customs that have unfortunately returned since the fall of communism. And then we have the Three Arch Bridge, which transports us into medieval Albania prior to its Ottoman occupation. And Kadare muses about what Albania might be like if there had never been an occupation. Through his art, he inscribes Albania and Albanian literature onto the canvas of world literature, exploring up close the intricacies of his culture, but also connecting it always to something larger. In a letter to Johann Eckermann, it's a very well-known letter from 1827, Goethe famously writes the following about world literature. I am more and more convinced that poetry is the universal possession of mankind, revealing itself everywhere and all times in hundreds and hundreds of men. National literature is now rather unmeaning as a term. The epoch of world literature is at hand, and everyone must strive to hasten its approach. An end quote. And when I think of Kadare, I think of a fundamentally Albanian writer who also fundamentally embodies world literature. I've heard him recount the beginnings of his writerly career as connected to a moment when, as a young boy looking for a ghost story in Albania, he began to copy his translation of Shakespeare's Macbeth by hand. And in some of his essays that I've translated, he discusses the influence of Shakespeare, but also of authors like Aeschylus and Dante on his writing. He connects the high art of these authors to the drama and performativity inherent to marital and funerary rites among individuals living in the Balkans. Even at a time when the Balkans were not necessarily producing proper literary texts prior to the 19th century, by looking at both oral literature and local customs, we have Kadare tracing the foundations of literariness in Albania, taking what we can see as one might traditionally see as a literary periphery in a small literature and connecting it to something larger, situating it within the same, I would argue, creative wellspring that gives rise to sort of major world literature. To give you some examples, one of the things I really like is how he ties, for instance, the figure of Hamlet to the Balkans and the traditions of blood vengeance in the region. And really contextualizing Hamlet as someone who could be born in this area or created, for instance, by oral rhapsodists from the region. And already in this very intentional connection of Albania to Shakespeare, we see Kadare equating the work of an established literary genius with the sort of haphazard work of the genius of many faceless Albanian oral rhapsodists. And he's already in doing so, putting Albania on the map of world literature, which I think is really important for the culture, for the nation. And moreover, he's constructing this alternative realm, an alternative Albania and the Balkans. As something bound up and thriving within the realm of literature and literary systems, even if reality and political systems brought mainly loss and defeat. So Albanian blood vengeance or Albanian political realities like Enver Hoxha's regime, which were nothing short of devastating in real life, in literature can become the foundations for tragedy or the sophisticated dystopian high modernism of Kadare's novels. And I think this dualism between the real and the literary, between the world itself as such and literature, which come together in Kadare's pursuit of world literature as such, is I think essential to how we should understand him both as a writer and a public figure. There's a brief passage in Kadare's, I'm sorry if I'm spoiling things, in Kadare's Neustadt acceptance speech that I translated. And I would like to read it briefly, because I think it really brings up this duality between the world and literature that I'm discussing. To believe in literature means to believe in a higher reality. To believe in literature means that your country's dark regime seems pale compared to the majestic literary funerary rites. To believe in this art means you always know that the government that dominates you, the police that surveil you, that the parliament, the bosses, the administration, tyranny itself are a mere temporary nightmare, dead matter, compared to the great order of which you have become initiated as a member. And that's the end of the quote. Within the bounds of literature, within the bounds of his art, for Cadare and Verhojo's totalitarian regime becomes the basis of Tabir Sarai, The Palace of Dream, from the 1981 novel, The Palace of Dreams. Tabir Sarai is the center of an irrational and arbitrary authoritarianism, where individuals are imprisoned for no good reason, other than a dream omen might indicate future crimes. And individual freedoms are encroached upon to the point that even the unconscious is laid bare, as dreams are collected by the state police. The only freedom possible in this kind of world is that of art. And art is what allows the writer to capture the distortion of the regime through the controlled and crafted lens of artistic refraction. Certainly, Cadare has drawn his fair share of ambivalence and controversy over the years, largely as a public figure in Albania, for not speaking out in one way or another, for not being a certain type of dissident, for not always being an activist public figure. He's 84 years old, but such expectations, I think, are natural given the occasional dearth of credible and objective voices in Albanian public life, both during communism and now. I find these expectations as not always entirely consistent with Cadare the writer and his artistic philosophy. His art exudes the need to use art and artistic refraction and escapism to construct psychic defenses against reality. The world of dreams and myth, or the warped lens of a highland society, helped the author construct a type of magical realism that was essential to his ability to create art and survive as an artist, despite the artistic pressures to conform to socialist realism. On the other hand, this world becomes the only path for the author to respond to the terrors of the present. It is in its ability to capture authoritarianism and in the process discredit it that art becomes a political weapon, that it can fight back against political regime, but again, do so through only its own devices. This fight, this response, is not one that unfolds loudly on the streets or even in the newspapers. It is, for Cadare, something that transpires within the layers and poetics of his art, because the moment that art mirrors the headlines of newspapers and the artist's voice speaks linearly to the present, not only does the artist run the risk of being erased within regimes like Hoxha's Albania, but the art itself starts to conform to the socialist, realist, and political expectations of various such regimes. And I'll end on a personal note. I'm almost done, I'm within my time. To me, as a first-generation Albanian immigrant, with all the identity fragmentations that identity entails, Cadare's art and its ability to speak to the universal through the particular and speak to the particular only through the universal provided one of the single most profound points of identity cohesion. In my study of works like The Palace of Dreams and in translating Cadare's writings, I felt my Albanian past and the world of literature that I devoted myself to as a scholar come together. Cadare speaks to history and to the present only from the vantage point of a great writer, and it is this vantage point that we're here to celebrate, and it is on account of this vantage point that his words will live past the present and speak to people all over the world and be read, I think, for many more decades and centuries to come. As an Albanian abroad, I'm grateful for his art. It has returned me time and again to Albania, to my parents, and to my grandparents' generations, and I'm grateful to be here speaking about it. So thank you.
Thank you, Ani, for those wonderful remarks, which really helped to contextualize Kadare's art. I wanted to say, I neglected to say this in my introduction, that Ani has written brilliant articles about both the Palace of Dreams and Three Elegies for Kosovo that you can easily find online, track down online if you are interested in hearing more of about her research into Kadare's work. Turning now to Dr. Fabrice Conte-Williamson. Fabrice is a director, actor, and theater educator teaching courses in performance and theater history, dramatic literature, and criticism in the theater arts department at the University of Wisconsin Parkside. He is also an OU alum. He did his PhD here in the School of Drama and Interdisciplinary program, as well as an MFA in directing. His primary research focuses on postmodern French dramatic literature and performance theory, the role of literary myth in dramatic literature, and the development of multilingual and cross-cultural theater movements. Later in the festival, you'll get to see the production of Stormy Weather on Mount Olympus that he has been working on with Susan Shaughnessy. Fabrice?
I too need to unmute. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. And I'm very grateful to be part of such a wonderful event that celebrates literature and the arts. First, I'd like to mention that my expertise, like Emily mentioned, is limited to Stormy Weather on Mount Olympus, which is the play that David Bellos and I co-translated over the past few months, and that Susan Shaughnessy is directing as a kind of audio book to be broadcast tomorrow at 10 as part of the festival. Perhaps the most important reason to engage with Kadare's body of work is first and foremost to discover the world of a contemporary author, someone who is shaping current European literature. And my experience has been that, especially with dramatic literature, European contemporary authors are too often overlooked by American scholars, critics, and theater practitioners. There's a lot of powerful theater happening around the world that doesn't seem to reach our American stages. Certainly, the process of translation is part of that challenge, but there are also significant differences in what is expected of a play structurally and thematically in contemporary American and European theaters. Let's acknowledge the fact that Kadare's tragédie belongs to one of the most enduring traditions in playwriting, the use of ancient myth as a vehicle for new storytelling. And this tradition is really as old as theater itself, from Aeschylus, who is most notably a character in Kadare's play, to Sophocles and Euripides, all the way to 21st century playwrights. These authors repeatedly engage in the retelling of literary myths, and in particular, ancient Greek myths. As a framework of reference, here are a few examples of the past 100 years. Eugene O'Neill's Morning Becomes Electra, Jean Cocteau's Infernal Machine, Giraudoux' Tiger at the Gates, Anou's Antigone, maybe the most famous of the 20th century, Jean-Paul Sartre's The Flies, Sarah Ruhl's Eurydice, and most recently, there's a very interesting text by Dia Loher, who's a German playwright who wrote a Manhattan Medea, very interesting play. The plays of Charles Mee are also an American playwright who writes a lot of Greek myths readapted to the contemporary stage also come to mind. The list is quite long, and Cadare is firmly asserting himself as a part of this tradition with his play Stormy Weather on Mount Olympus. There are two reasons for this fundamental tie between theater and myth. The first reason is cultural and historical, and the second has to do with the function of the myth itself. Historically, theater as an art form has been the most sophisticated and yet democratic way for the telling of myths. In many societies where most of the population could not read or write, the theater was still able to bring these foundational stories to large communities during rituals and other types of performative events. Ancient Greek theater played a fundamental role in the cohesive and unified identity of classical Athens because the myths served as anchors or markers for social, cultural, and political identity. Thanks to the great interest in ancient Greece and ancient Rome during the Renaissance, this cultural legacy has become inextricable from European literary tradition at large. Secondly, the function of the myth is to reveal a universal truth about the human experience that goes beyond specific cultural, political, and historical boundaries. Therefore, whether the myth of Prometheus is told in Aeschylus's trilogy, or Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or Kadare's Stormy Weather on Mount Olympus, it resonates with readers and with audiences because of its seemingly unshakable insight into human nature. This universality explains why the myth of Prometheus and many other ancient myths remain so potent and so relevant even today. The myth also creates layers of meaning that engage audiences on multiple levels. For example, the story of Zeus and Prometheus can simply be enjoyed as a sort of Olympian soap opera, or it can serve as a metaphor for a certain period in Albanian history that, as we know, is at the heart of Kadare's oeuvre. But that metaphor remains only accessible to those who are familiar with the particular sociopolitical and cultural context in question. The indirect nature of the metaphor also allows the author to speak without saying a word. The myth is a key to bypass censorship and political retributions. Furthermore, the use of the myth creates an immediate connection between its universal truth and the contemporary environment. It is quite obvious and somewhat painful, if I must be honest, when reading Stormy Weather on Mount Olympus, that we tend to automatically connect some of the figures in the play, as well as some of the systems that Cadare describes, to similar figures and systems in our own current political landscape. Throughout the translation process over the summer, there were many instances when a headline in the New York Times would eerily echo one of Zeus's speeches in the play. Thus, the use of myth and Stormy Weather on Mount Olympus shifts the focus from a precise historical account of Albanian history to a universal exploration of everlasting themes, just as the quest for power and the struggle to keep it, political dissent, and faith in human progress. Everyone, no matter their insight into the playwright's personal experience, will recognize those themes and more easily engage with Kadare's discourse. By using the myth of Prometheus as a canvas for Stormy Weather, Kadare virtually frees himself and frees the reader or audience from the narrative question of, how does the play end? On the contrary, because he chooses to engage with such a well-known story, our attention is immediately refocused on the playwright's specific choices in the retelling of that story. This is now about how the story unfolds, what precise details Kadare decides to emphasize, and what particular light he chooses to shine on each episode of the myth. Therefore, the experience becomes incredibly delightful for those of us already familiar with the myth of Prometheus, as we're at times surprised and moved and entertained as Kadare so brilliantly leads us through the familiar labyrinth. The use of humor is, of course, quite notable. The various anachronisms, the shifts in tone, in particular the banter with the goddesses, both further emphasize the dichotomy between political struggle and the daily lives of the people. In other words, the stakes are high, but most of the characters are almost unable to act upon the urgency of political oppression. And as a theater artist and scholar, I must say that I thoroughly enjoyed engaging with Kadare's play, and that I found it incredibly enlightening and thought-provoking, even though when I started, I had very little background in the playwright's own journey. There is no doubt that it would be a challenging play to produce on stage, given the very large cast and the amount of spectacle it calls for. But nevertheless, it stands as a great representation of contemporary European dramatic literature, and it reminds us of the power of theater and myth in our attempt to speak to universal audiences about complex and nuanced questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fabrice, for your wonderful presentation. I'm really looking forward to the radio play tomorrow. Moving forward, the next speaker is Peter Constantine. He is a professor and director of the Literary Translation Program at the University of Connecticut. His recent translations include works by Augustine, Rousseau, Machiavelli, and Tolstoy, and you might note how many languages are represented there. He also translated 3 elegies for Kosovo by Ismail Kadare, or Elegy for Kosovo as it is also known. He is a Guggenheim Fellow and was awarded the PEN Translation Prize for 6 early stories by Thomas Mann and the National Translation Award for the Undiscovered Chekhov, right? Peter?
Thank you very much. In talking about what interests me particularly in Cadare, the very, very first thing that interests me is his style. And in talking about that, I would like to start with a little Chekhov story, referring to what you've just mentioned as the Undiscovered Chekhov, which I translated so many years ago. There was a story in there called the Medal. And what happened is that there is a big party in Moscow. The story is written around 1880. Big party in Moscow with lots of champagne and celebration. And a man about town and well-known author walks in. The celebration really is for this author because he has just gotten a cross medal, great distinction. They're trying to find out, what is it? Show us the medal, show us the medal. Now, Chekhov is a very, his comedy really does hit the mark, the timing is amazing. And what happens is he finally holds up what the medal is. And what the medal is a short story with a red cross through it, a censor's cross. On the first side, on the second side, and the third side, it has been disallowed. Now, the Russian imperial censor was a dangerous entity that had to be sidestepped carefully. Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Tolstoy, everyone had to work around it. And what happened there with these authors is they figured out delicate ways of saying things but not saying them, working the way around, being quite direct, but really understanding like how far they can go and what they can do. And I think this is something that has also, I think that Cadare as a writer, of course, grew up in the world's most harsh totalitarian government at the time. And for him to write, I think his schooling in writing had to take that into account. How do I say something without saying it, but saying it and saying it very specifically? And I think that is the absolute genius of his work, sidestepping. Who knows if there had not been censorship, what would have happened? You know, freedom to write and express. Whereas here, there was no freedom at all, none whatsoever. And I will also say that the censor in Albania was far harsher than the censor in Imperial Russia. So Chekhov did not, I mean, the author in Chekhov's story was not put in handcuffs and dragged off to a concentration camp. The story was disallowed. It was a problem, but it was just a personal problem in that sense. Next time round, that great author who was celebrated in Chekhov's story would do better, hopefully, and would know how to sidestep it. Now, in Albania, where even, I mean, it rivaled and perhaps surpassed the Stalinist censor, to which so many authors, one of my favorite authors whose complete works I translated, Isaac Babel, managed also to sidestep, but pushed his luck, kept pushing his luck until finally he disappeared in the great purges of 1939, 1940, when so many Soviet authors fell to that. So Cadare ran the risk of either the Central Committee, the Sigurimi, the Directorate of the Press, the Education, any one of these different entities in Albania at the time could point the finger and say this is not allowed. So it wasn't just one censorship bureau that had to deal with that. So that is a personal beginning that I wanted to talk about his style, because even in, I found when I translated 3 elegies for Kosovo, that there was that elegance. He said things in such a specific and direct way, and yet also in such a peripatetic and not direct way. And in what I said in our last panel, from an interview by Jack Marina, who had interviewed in 2008, had interviewed Kadare, I want to quote a very small piece again, because Kadare does say something interesting that I think also goes for his work. When he translated the Oresteia, what he found interesting was the ambiguities, the uncertainties, the nebulous saturation, the darker parts of many of Aeschylus' verses that are not rationally explicable. And we do see that, I think, in many of his works. I saw that in Elegy for Kosovo. So what happened in Elegy of Kosovo? It's a very simple plot, really. In 1389, June 15th, there was the Battle of Kosovo, the Ottomans fighting the Serbs. That's what we have heard from the great Serbian epics. In fact, they sing and they celebrate that with major figures such as Marko Kraljevic, who's come down in legend as being one of the legendary figures there. What Cadare does, however, is show us maybe a bit more of a realistic picture, but maybe without saying it so directly. It wasn't just the Serbs and the Ottomans. There were Albanian princes there, there were Hungarian princes. Hungary went all the way down to the Croatian areas today. There were Greeks. So it was a big collection of Christian princes fighting the Muslim. But it's done in a very sidestepping way, let's say. What we see is, who are the two characters really? And the two protagonists are two minstrels. One is a Serbian minstrel, one is an Albanian minstrel. And they have come with their princes to sing the glories of each prince, of Lazar, King Lazar, Prince Lazar, Marko. They all brought their own minstrels to sing their glory and also to remember in future epics their glory, as did the Albanian princes. And when the battle goes terribly wrong and the arm, it's a dreadful defeat, the minstrels flee. They flee to the north together, the Serbian and the Albanian minstrel. What is interesting is that as they go north, they come to a castle where there's an old princess who listens to their songs and is surprised, because even though they're friends, when they start singing, it is the Albanian will sing down with the Serbs, long live the Albania. The Serbian will sing down with the Albanians, long live the Serbs. And yet when she asks them about their ancient myth, they will speak about the old, ancient, maybe even Homeric moments. And it is part of Kadare's idea that all this has remained within the epic works of the Balkans. I've gotten a bit carried away here, and I'm not sure how much more I have. Can somebody indicate? There were one or two more things I wanted to say, but I don't want to go on a great length.
I think you have a little time. We're doing fine on time.
Okay, good. So now, my connection to Albania is that I'm from an area in Greece with a confederation of villages that Arberor, 12th century. That's in fact what the first kingdom of Albania was called. We thought we were Pelasgians, but we've sort of realized that there is a link. We can understand each other's language, as it is a language that developed from medieval Albanian into what it was, whereas modern Albanian developed in its own way. Now, in our myths, of course, what is interesting about the Battle of Kosovo, besides the fact that Alexander the Great had taken over Kosovo, Kosovopedia in Greek, which means blackbird, Kosovopedia, blackbird plain, but it's also blackbird plain in Serb, and it's been called that ever since. Kosovo's ours because because Alexander the Great was there. Kosovo is Serbian because Marko and Lazar were there. Kosovo is Albanian because the Albanian princes were there. And maybe that is all true. And that is what's coming out in what is so interesting in that deep, deep insight in three elegies for Kosovo, that Balkan view of myth and using myth to create history and having history reflected in the myth, and this going back and forth is beautifully and clearly described in that book. So why should we read Kadare? I would say read that book. It is an amazingly clear layout of the Balkan historicity, the history of the Balkans, and how various Balkan people see that themselves, including the Averroes or the Greek, who also, by the way, claim Marko as a Greek figure. Marko Kraljes, we call him in Greek. Markos Kraljes, Marko Kraljevic. He also has an Albanian name. Anyway, that inclusiveness in its vagueness but specificity is, I think, what is the great gift in all the works that Cadare has written. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was wonderful. That's one of my favorite pieces by Cadare. Our next speaker is Professor David Bellos. He is a professor of French and comparative literature, as well as the director of the program in translation and intercultural communication at Princeton University. He has written biographies of Georges Perec and Jacques Tati that have been translated into many languages, and a wonderful, wonderful readable introduction to translation studies is that of Fish in Your Ear. He has translated numerous authors from French and offers a new understanding of the extraordinary life and work of Romain Gary in Romain Gary, A Tall Story. Dr. Bellos?
Well, thank you. I hate these introductions. They all sound like an obituary. Thank you also, Annie and Peter and Fabrice. All of what you've said is both true and fascinating, but it isn't actually an answer to the questions why we should read Ismail Kadare. The reason we should read Ismail Kadare is that he is a great storyteller. He tells wonderful stories, and many of them. In some ways, he's like Balzac, but Balzac is really rather boring because he only writes about one little place called Paris and roughly the 1820s. Cadare takes us to ancient Egypt. He takes us to modern China. He takes us to a tourist resort on the Baltic Sea, to Moscow, to Austria, and of course to the Ottoman Empire. There's a whole almost Jules Verne-like capacity for traveling the world if you read Ismail Kadare. And he covers all ages since the invention of script, from Cheops building the Great Pyramid right down to arguments over the succession of Enver Hoxha in Albania, and down to events and situations that take place in Western Europe after the fall of communism, with novels that are set in the 19th century, in the early 20th, Broken April set in the 1930s. There are novels set in the 1940s. The General of the Dead Army is set in the 1950s. You can actually read the history of the world by reading the fictional oeuvre of Ismail Kadare. And that's why you should read it, and that's why I love it, because it is a whole world of its own. It's a parallel universe. I mean, Cadare, is a dramatist. He is an essayist. He was a journalist and an editor for a time, but his first claim to fame, for those who can read Albanian, is that he was a poet, and indeed a very great poet, though that side of his work has tailed off over the last 25 years. And so I guess we know him, and we can only really know him as a fiction writer. But he's not a writer of any standard kind of fiction. I mean, some of his stories are tiny, only 5 pages long, and some of his novels are 500 pages long, And there are works of more or less every length in between. There are long short stories, and then there are short novellas, and then longer things that Cadare himself calls micro novels. And then there are kind of standard length novels, and then there are big sagas. So in terms of formal construction, you have a tremendous variety to explore within a work that itself explores the whole world. Now, I know it's conventional to read Cadare as really talking about Albania, and that all these places and times are actually just slightly displaced metaphors about his life in Albania under the Hoxha regime. And there is an element of truth in that, but you don't have to take any notice of it. You can read them as stories that just work as stories, because he really is a master storyteller. He can get you can get even me, old cynic that I am, interested in ghosts, interested in brides who travel hundreds of miles overnight on a flying horse, on corpses that rise from the grave. It's quite difficult to get me to take that seriously, but Cadare manages to. I think that, this world, I call it Cadare. And Cadare, just sort of sum up, seems to me to have 7 main features. One is, of course, the looming presence all the time of certain myths of ancient Greece, of ancient Greek literature. Not the whole of Greek mythology, but essentially the myths that dramatize 2 things, family hatreds and the relationship to power. The second thing that is always present in Cadare are elements of Balkan folk tales. We'll call them Albanian because it's Albanian, but he knows well, and he often points out that these folk tales exist also in many other languages, and they circulate through Cadare's oeuvre. The third thing I would say that is always present in every Cadare novel is a relationship between the personal and the political. I mean, he tells stories of personal relationships within that cannot avoid being political or having political meaning. And I don't mean just sort of contemporary political, I mean political in the broader sense, having to do with the manipulation of others and the manipulation of power. Next, I think I'm on number 4. What's wonderful about Cadare is the weather. It makes Scotland seem like the Riviera. The weather in Cadare is always really dreadful. And I think you fairly quickly twig that this is a literary motif. It's to set a mood, and it's to tell you this is not a happy story, and it's to be absolutely anti-socialist realist. I mean, there are no blonde maidens sitting astride a tractor bringing in the sun-ripened harvest of grain. It's actually almost humorously unpicturesque. And the last thing I would mention, one thing I would mention is that what's wonderful about Cadare is that his characters are often not sure whether they are awake or asleep. Typical Cadare sentences begin is, "It seemed to him that," or he wasn't quite sure whether. The borderline between being able to see clearly and not being able to see clearly is forever being massaged through these stories, so that reading a Cadare novel, something like Dorantine or even The General of the Dead Army, by the time you finish reading it, you're not quite sure whether you've had a dream or not. Cadare is really masterful at nudging us towards doubting the difference, actually, towards wondering whether and in what way life is like a dream, and in what way dreams are like life. And it is not a surprise at all that one of his absolutely central works that Ani has already mentioned, The Palace of Dreams, is indeed about the manipulation of dreams. Cadare is the great manipulator of dreams, or of dreaminess and dreamlikeness. And it's very special. It's unlike any other novelist that I have ever read. And finally, one of the reasons you should all read Cadare is that despite the ghastly weather, despite the fogginess of people's minds and the terrible stories of power and oppression that he tells, he's actually quite funny. You have to sort of get into it, but he is quite funny. And there's a kind of a sly, cunning humor, situational, but also verbal, that comes through all the multiple translations. Cadare's oeuvre has not changed from its beginnings in the 1960s to today. It is true that his life has changed massively, and the political and social and economic landscape of the Balkans and of Western Europe has changed beyond recognition. But Cadare's novels and stories are all connected to each other. They're not connected as chapters. There's no order in which to read them. But little detail in one novel will become the nugget of a whole chapter in another one. A reference to a place like the Inn of the Two Roberts in one novel, you will find out is the setting of another story. And it seems to me that Cadare actually hasn't written 40 or 50 or whatever it is, stories and novels. He's written one oeuvre. And he has spent the last, 60 years now taking pieces of it and giving them to us. But it's an integral whole thing. And I know scholars, I'm sure, will write long books about the development of Cadare's art and tracking it against the changes in his position and his location. But and that will, I'm sure, be very interesting. But the real message and the real truth is this: it is a single imaginary universe in which everything is related to everything else, and in which the manner of telling, the style of telling, the art of Cadare really hasn't changed one iota since he began writing. So that's why we should read Cadare, why you should read Cadare. And I'm only sorry that you can only read about a third of Cadare in English. You can read a lot more of it in French. So it's quite a good reason for learning French if you don't want to learn Albanian.
Thank you so much. That was just wonderful. I think if I may, I'm going to kick the discussion off with a question that's really to the panel as a whole, but also partly grows out of David's remarks just now. And that is, I was wondering if you could comment on the way that Cadare exploits his own biography in his fiction, because it seems that much like Dostoevsky in some respects, he is an author who expects his reader to know his biography to some extent and often plays with it. Teases out details, right? Rewrites stories for us again and again, returns to the same autobiographical settings. And I was wondering if you could comment about that.
Me? Yeah.
Well, in general.
Yeah. Well, Cadare has used elements of his own life in his fiction, notably in Chronicle in Stone. But generally, no. I mean, well, he uses elements of his own, at least bits of his own life in his novel about the Gorky Institute of Literature in Moscow. It's called Twilight of the Eastern Gods in English. And I mean, he's used his friendship and acquaintance with translators to write about Hodja in Moscow in the Great Winter, or the Winter of Our Discontent, but it's not available in English yet. But for me, broadly, no. I mean, stories about ancient Egypt and China and so on, and the Ottoman Empire, these are not autobiographical. He's not a self-writer at all. He's actually a very modest person in his writing.
Well, I
in
guess
my view, anyway, that's the way I react, but Annie may have a different view.
No, I mean, I similarly, I think it's interesting. I think he's really self-effacing, actually. Like it's very much erasing his, and like really displacing himself. Yep. At the same time, I do think that over time, in later years, I see more snippets. You know, you have the Migration of the Stork, where you have this writer figure. You have the occasional snippets of autobiography, but I think if anything, Emily, I would say he's uncomfortable with that, and it is only coming later as he's like now perhaps self-mythologizing a little bit. But I think, it's not like Tolstoy,
It's not like Tolstoy at all. No, I mean, that story that you're referring to, the migration of the stork, which is about, what's his name, Lagouchi, yeah? Mm-hmm. That is a personal memory, and he did meet the poet, but it goes back quite a way, that story, actually. I can't quite remember the date of the original, but that's not recent at all. Yes, and he writes about his aunts and aged ladies in the story that he wrote in when he was at the visiting writer at Bard College. So there are elements of self-writing, but it's not dominant in the work as a whole.
Thank you very much. Well, let's move on to questions from the audience because we've collected quite a few. I see a question from Chris for Fabrice. What is one striking aspect of Cadare's approach to literary myth in Stormy Weather on Mount Olympus that helps him stand out among other plays from other authors that you have staged or directed of the same genre?
That's a great question. I don't know. I think there's a lot of elements in the play that actually link him to other authors in the treatment of the myth. First and foremost, I think the humor that David just mentioned is something that we find in a lot of 20th and 21st century retelling of ancient myths. And it's quite delightful because it's unexpected, although it is a tradition. So in the end, for us, it is expected. But I think for an audience member going to see a tragedy, the subtitle to the play is Tragedy of Prometheus. So clearly he's telling us this is going to be this type of play, and then the first scene is quite comical. So maybe I think in that sense, I think it's fairly traditional compared to other plays that take on the same project. Something that I did notice is the epic scope that Cadare's play, maybe because he's not necessarily a playwright from the start. His play does not, I think, worry too much about production, about what would be, how do you put that on the stage, basically. And most of the other plays that I've worked on and that I'm familiar with that are also retelling of myths very often are from theatrical practitioners. And so they're more pragmatic in the type of characters, what's going on stage, what is expected. So Stormy Weather really engages your imagination as you're reading because it is so grandiose and it is so, the pictures and the descriptions and the stage directions are absolutely wonderful, and would be a great challenge for a design team, for a lighting designer in particular. I think it would be such an exciting project, but also the scale of it may make it prohibitive for somebody to decide to produce this show because it demands quite a lot. So maybe in that sense, that's where the innovation comes from to me.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question for Ani. How do you think Cadare's novel mirrors the fin de siècle sinister climate if one takes into account the horror of the Albanian communist regime?
That is a very interesting question. So, I mean, I think, I don't know. I mean, I also saw a question in there about the sort of collective, the archetypal unconscious. I mean, I think these are all really interesting questions. I find Cadare really slippery in terms of literary influences, in the sense that I think that there's not usually any one particular place where one could pinpoint oh, this is the fin de siècle, or oh, this is, I don't know, surrealism, or it's this or that. I think I've sort of written about it as a kind of pastiche of influences. And I think that's part of, I think that's just kind of, he's very slippery that way. So I don't know that, I think, I think will you read me the second part of the question about the Albanian piece of it? Because I think I responded to the first part, but I'm not quite catching the second part. You're muted.
If one takes into account the horror of the Albanian communist regime.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know. I think, you know, I sort of also agreed with what David said, that it's not, you know, it is about Albania, but it is also not about Albania, right? I mean, I think it's just about, it's a kind of, and I also, you know, the kind of storytelling that he does is really compelling also. One thing that came to my mind as I was hearing David speak was about, you know, even in his essays, he does this like plotting and this sort of like, there's a kind of crescendo in the narrative where you're just like, there's drama, even in things that don't actually have plot. So I think, you know, some of those kind of extreme emotions perhaps could fit interestingly into certainly the drama of the Findesackle. And the psychic, you know, malaise, if you will, I don't know. But I'm really hesitant to sort of pin him down to any one particular influence. He's
terrific.
Can I come in on that?
Yeah. Oh, please.
I have quizzed Ismail on literary influences, and it's very disturbing. Slippery is not the word. Kafka, I said, and he said, who? It turns out that he's only ever read 4 pages of Kafka. I think the most important influence on Ismail Kadare is Sholokhov. Sholokhov is everything Kadare does not want to be. Yeah, he writes against a certain idea of positive heroes, chronological time flow, lavish description, and of course political correctness. But that's actually technically, you know, you could read every Cadare story as an example of how a Soviet author would not treat the subject. And that's much more powerful than any positive identification, because I think that, you know, when Cadare goes for his morning walk on the beach at Durres, you know, he's sort of always grumpily pondering around. He's talking to Dante and Homer, Shakespeare and Goethe. These are his chums. I don't think he's read much 20th century literature at all, actually. What he reads and rereads are the great classics, and in particular, the Greeks, and also Shakespeare. They're present to him in a way that perhaps most of us don't really have any authors that are like personal friends. So I just stopped trying to place him in the field of modern. He's just Cadare. He's just there.
I'll just make an additional comment, which was when I met him for the first time last summer, and I mentioned that I was a Tolstoy scholar. He just looked at me like,
no.
why would you do this? And let me convince you not to do this. And it's almost like he was just insulted that I would devote so much, and became this thing about discrediting Tolstoy and his writing. That was serious.
Yeah.
But
no, he's much more eloquent on what he doesn't read than on what he does. Yeah.
I have a question from Pamela Genova for Fabrice. How does Cadare's use of literary myth compare to the 20th century literary and theatrical rereadings of the mythic figures of ancient Greece and Rome, particularly in the French tradition?
Well, I think some of the things we've mentioned about the use of myth to discuss a particular situation, you know, we think about Anhui and occupation during the war, using Antigone as a way to speak freely without saying, you know, anything specific. I think we could see some comparisons with Stormy Weather, and the great humor and anachronisms that come through with a sort of revisited Olympian world where people have cars and there's technology and we can sort of live in this limbo of worlds and not question it. I think that's also really interesting about Stormy Weather, is that this ambiguity about time is something that he's putting forward on purpose. And it serves the play greatly, in fact, because it really points out the difference between what's going on Earth, what's going on Mount Olympus. So in that way, I think there's a lot of similarities between what's going on, maybe the golden age of that myth revival in the 30s and 40s in French theater. It's quite similar. I think it is also different in the sense that it doesn't seem like it's a necessity for Cadare to approach the story in that way, but more of a choice that he embraces rather than being a defensive, act. And I need to write about this particular topic, but I don't want to be censored, or I don't want to be necessarily have any retributions. Clearly, it's more of, there's an artistic choice that maybe comes first, and I think that's interesting. And we see that with other playwrights as well. And I don't think that's ever going to go away. It seems like in the entire history of theater, what I teach my students there, every semester, we keep talking about literary myths, and in particular Greek mythology, and it never goes away, no matter if we're talking about ancient Greece or if we're talking about contemporary theater. So.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I have a question from Daniel Simon for Peter specifically. Could you comment on the metaphor of the singer's musical instruments like the lahuta in 3 Elegies for Kosovo? Cadare also compares the term Balkans being imposed on the many peoples in the region as a tortoise shell, yet Cadare's artists sing through and despite this shell on their backs.
Yes, actually that is a very good question. And before I wanted to say one more thing about Cadare's reading as well. Before I touch on that. Some 20 years ago, I translated a story by Bashkim Shehu, who also appears in some of Cadare's novels as a character, in fact, in The Successor, because his father was supposed to be the successor. Anyway, I don't necessarily want to touch on that as a very difficult and problematic topic, but Bashkim Shehu wrote a book called The Dictator's short story called The Dictator's Library. And what it's in fact more of a real, it's not a story, it's just a piece of prose where they went into Hoxha's library after Albania fell apart. Sorry, I didn't mean Albania fell apart, after Hoxha's regime fell apart, and found an amazing library of all the classics. He was very into French police fiction. Whatever you wanted, you could find there, but you couldn't find it elsewhere. So Pushkin and Tolstoy, Chekhov appeared in Albanian versions, but heavily censored, with passage after passage after passage cut out. So that's one thing to keep in mind as to how things were back then. But so as far as the Lahuta is concerned, now the epics and the ancient myths were sung by minstrels, they weren't spoken. And I think that even in our Arberor villages in Greece now, what is left of our myths are really more, well, I would ask my uncle, for instance, about a certain myth of this woman, gnome who a prince falls in love with, and which would have been sung in the old days, but now he says, well, this is what it is, and he will then speak the words. Then it turns into a poem. It is transmogrified, if one can even say that, from something that would have been sung with a lahuta, which is a stringed instrument from northern Albania, that the Geg people, the Tosk of the south, the Geg of the north, who are known to have an incredible tradition in epic song. So I'm not sure if there's necessarily a symbol behind that, but that's actually part of the reality of how these epics went on. As far as Balkan is concerned, when the Turks arrived, they said, "You are Balkans. You're not Serb and Albanian and Arberoris and Shqip and these different. You are Balkans," and that we, the Balkan people, then accepted it, accepted this foreign term, and then accepted 4 or 5 centuries of occupation from the Ottomans. So that I think is the is what's also an interesting element in Elegy of Kosovo and also in other works.
I have a question from Elizabeth. Ani, I learned so much from your presentation. Thank you. Would you link the engagement with the unconscious and dualism with the real and unreal in Kadare's work to magical realism or earlier theories like stream of consciousness in modernist literature? Would a theory like Carl Gustav Jung's archetype and the collective unconscious help in analyzing Kadare's work? And this is the question you referenced earlier.
Yeah, and I think we've sort of like covered a lot of that. I mean, again, I remember going and reading Jung and trying to see like, is this the influence? And it didn't, it was like chasing my tail, I mean, for quite a while, and it didn't quite pan out. But so yes and no. Right, I mean, I think it does access some of these, you know, theoretical constructs. And again, I don't, you know, again, we don't know exactly where, right? We don't know if he read it cover to cover, like David was saying. Like, it's just, you know, he read 8 pages and kind of surmised the rest. And then, I don't know, you know, and mixed it with something else, Albanian myth, you know.
Okay, and
yeah, I mean, you know, like most writers, prolific writers, Kadare doesn't have time to read very much. He's writing all the time. And in the afternoons he watches football on TV. He does. That's his relaxation. I think you could probably do a Jungian analysis of the corpus of Kadare's work. And that might be very interesting to do, but I don't think it would tell you anything about how it came to be. But just that Cadare does indeed delve into some of the things that Jung is interested in, shared dreams, archetypal dreams. So that, I mean, you know, Jung might help you to make a kind of sense of Cadare as a reader, but I don't think it will tell you anything about how Cadare's oeuvre came into existence.
Okay, and here's a question for everyone or David. We'd love to hear an example or two of Kadare's humor.
No, I wouldn't attempt. It's very subtle, and I'd have to read you quite a long passage. Please discover Kadare's humor by reading 2 or 3 of his books. That's much the best way. And you'll find it hidden in little corners here and there. It's never overt. It's never like, it's not Charlie Chaplin, but it is there. There is a sly humor, but you have to get attuned to it. There aren't any jokes, I can tell you, from Cadare. It's not full of jokes.
I think it would be interesting to listen to the broadcast tomorrow and to see the play being spoken by actors and with the work of the director. I think this might, I'm hoping, I haven't heard it yet, so I'm excited to hear it tomorrow, but I'm hoping that some of the humor in the play comes through, although it's been obviously edited to fit the 1-hour format. Yeah. Edited quite heavily because it's a long play. Yeah. But hopefully this some of the humor will come through. So
I think I'm just thinking now, and again, I've started to keep going to like the migration of the stork, mainly because I spent a lot of time translating that. So it's very familiar to me in my head right now. But I just, you know, this whole story is about, you know, an 80-something-year-old writer having a love affair and the scandal and the sort of provincial Albanian town at this, you know, that's very prudish about this sort of embarrassing, you know, he's embarrassed all of us with this love affair. And, you know, you sort of Cadare kind of like playing up on that. Or the New Yorker story about the Albanian Writers Union is reflected.
Oh, yes.
I mean, that, you know, all the sort of self-exploration and self-mockery. And it's a kind of interesting, but that's what I meant earlier when I said that there are little, you see snippets of his kind of personality come out at the end in this sort of self-mockery that I find really interesting. But I can't think of very many others.
Okay, that's wonderful. And here's a question for David Bellos. Do you think the Twilight of the Eastern Gods is autofiction?
No, I don't. No. I don't think that's a useful term for it. It draws very directly on Cadare's personal experience as a student in the Soviet Union in 1958 and 1959. and it involves some real people that he met there, like Yevgeny Yevtushenko. But it's not an autobiographical. The narrator of the story is not a self-expression of Ismail Kadare. He's highly fictionalized and transposed, and the love affair he has is not remotely related to what he actually got up to in Moscow. So it's something else. It is a fiction. It's a novel about the Soviet Union, about the twilight of the Soviet gods, the collapse or the slow decay of Soviet ideology as seen by a student at the Gorky Institute. But it's not about Cadare. It's not a fictionalization of Cadare as self. So that's why I don't think, I mean, autofiction is usually a term used for those writers like Rob Grillet and others who are writing explicitly about themselves, but lying. And tell you that they're lying. They are presenting themselves as someone else, but it's about themselves. Well, Cadare is not writing about himself. He's writing about what he learned in Moscow and what he didn't learn, or rather, what he learned not to, what he learned to like and not to like. I mean, it is about the culture, atmosphere, and goings on in Moscow in 1958 to 1960, including, incidentally, the Pasternak affair. It's fascinating. It's the only account that exists of the Pasternak affair told not by somebody from the West and not by somebody from Moscow. And that's why it's very precious in that it's an almost independent sidelight on the persecution of Boris Pasternak after the award of the Nobel Prize for for his whole work, but for Zhivago especially.
Thank you very much. Here is a question for all of you, since you are all translators of Cadare. Do you think that translation is a sort of ongoing intimate conversation and a telepathic bonding between the author and the translator?
Telepathic? No. No. I mean, I've got, we have his words to read and to work with. That's not telepathy. But yes, it is a conversation with the author. In the case of Cadare, it's an actual conversation. I mean, he doesn't mind talking to his translators. And he is one of those authors for which we should all be very grateful, who doesn't have any hang-ups about translation. He believes that what he writes can be understood in any language. But yes, he also likes to, or not always, but he is prone to regarding a translation, perhaps especially into English, as an opportunity for improving the work. And some of the differences between the Albanian, the French, and the English come from Cadare's actual intervention, saying, yeah, let's cut this paragraph. It wasn't very good in the first place, or I want to add a bit here or there. So there are, I mean, not huge differences, but there are differences that come from that ongoing conversation.
Actually, I wanted to ask you, David, to just in case it wasn't clear, you mean that Cadare went back to his original works and said, oh, this paragraph could be done differently. In other words, in reaction to his translation. Is that what you meant?
Well, he can, I mean, he can read my translation because I always send him the drafts. But I mean, his English isn't terribly good. But with Ismail, as you know, the question is what is the original text is highly theoretical, because he rewrites himself in Albanian. Every edition, well, not every edition, but most of his works have gone through more than one edition, more than one iteration, with matter added and taken away. The French translations also have had matter added, and I know I've actually seen him editing the Albanian original so that it corresponds more closely to the French translation, so that there is a circulation of text. And as we were saying all the way through, Cadare is a storyteller. He's not a manic chiseler of prose in the manner of Flaubert. I mean, he writes wonderfully, but he when a thing is done, he's often inclined to do it again or to do it a bit better, to polish it up, whether that's in the original language or in the first translated language or in the second or the third. So, I mean, one day when some great national institution decides to fund a critical variorum edition of the oeuvre of Ismail Kadare, it will be many, many tens of volumes long, because each work will have to have an appendix this long. No, perhaps not each work, but many of his major works will have to have that. And they change their titles as well.
We have a wonderful question from Ilona Pira to everyone. Question, to turn the heading on its head, what should we not read Cadare for? I am specifically referring to those who hope that in reading him, they will visit a place, namely Albania. How do writers like him escape this burden of being the tourism agency for their country?
Do you want to answer that, Ani?
I mean, I think it's a really good question. Yeah, I think it might make someone want to visit Albania, like in sort of general terms, you know, who is familiar, but it would create some interest potentially, although it's very far from the real Albania. I mean, I think at the same time, I don't know. At the same time, I do think it connects to Albania in very interesting ways. Like I said when I was speaking, I definitely rediscovering him as a graduate student and sort of like connecting with the Albanian-ness of his text was really profound to me. And you know, his writings, I think Adona has also made some comments about his writing, which is, I think, you know, it's incredible. And as a native speaker, I just really struggle even trying to figure out what he's saying, because sometimes he uses synonyms of words that are very sort of complicated and again, to avoid the sort of Turkicisms of Albanian, and very interesting, complicated. And so in a way, I personally felt grateful when I translated some of his essays, because they were a little less complicated in the writing. He just seemed more straightforward there. But I think he does incredible things with Albanian. I think Albanian language.
I think there is one good reason to not read Ismail or Cadare: sex. Because of the culture in which he was working and writing, he doesn't write very much about sex, but he does on purpose to be provocative. And some of his passages in the stories about sexual interactions between the characters really be quite good candidates for that special award given in London every year called the Bad Sex Award. I had to have a certain sympathy, because it's just very daring for him to even mention knickers in Albania. But from our point of view, he writes about it absolutely clunkingly. It's embarrassment, really. It isn't necessary anymore. It isn't the point he's making of writing about intimate things in a culture or society that was very, very prim and proper. That he doesn't need to make that point again, or now, or to us. So there you are. There's one reason for not bothering to read Ismail Kadare.
Does anyone have anything to add, or shall I move on to the next question? Here is another question from Christine. Do you think that securing professional visibility for literary translators could impact the relationship between the author and a translator? Do authors voice this visibility issue as much as translators do?
I didn't really understand the question.
Okay, I'll try again. Do you think that securing professional visibility for literary translators could impact the relationship between an author and a translator? Do authors voice this visibility issue as much as translators do?
Professional visibility.
Can I say something to that? Actually, it's a very interesting anti-question in a sense, because as Christine, you mentioned, right, pointed out, at Penn and at Alta for
professional visibility. Yes, sorry.
fighting to get our names on the cover as translators, to be part of the work. Whereas it is argued as well in certain publishing circles, and it has been in other words, Penn or Alta in trying to secure more visibility, have been told, well, we don't want to underline that this is a translation. We don't want to put, this is about Kafka, not about you. This is about Ismail Kadare. This is not about you. Do we want Peter Constantine presents Ismail Kadare, or do we just want Ismail Kadare? Now, I've not come across authors who have had issues with that. I think in some cases as well, you might also find when I think back to our previous generation of translators like William Weaver, who translated The Name of the Rose. Many authors would be very happy to have William Weaver as well on the book. It will sell more copies if we're just looking at it from a purely technical perspective. In the Russian world, we have Pavir and Volokhonsky, who have been translating all the great 19th century novels again. Their name on a cover is a good thing. It should be there. So, but it is a very interesting question, and I think it took us by surprise, because we've all been facing in the direction of more visibility for the translator, and have not really given it any thought, and I'm speaking for myself mainly, what it might be like from an author's perspective, but it hasn't come up in the last 30 years when I've been translating. Many authors have not had a problem with that.
I'd like to add something to Peter's remarks, because at least in my field, in theatrical production, in the past few years, there's been a great emphasis on selecting translations of foreign works from particular translator. And I'm thinking about the success that Christopher Hampton has had as a playwright, but also as a translator. And then there has been, people will say, which translation are you using for your production? Oh, I'm using this person's translation. Oh, well, that's the better text. And because the theater, brings the piece to a large public, and it's publicized in certain ways regularly, I think the question of the translator is becoming more and more important, especially when it comes to plays that have multiple translators. I always get this question all the time, and I'm frustrated with it. Is, oh, I'm producing this Tartuffe. Which translation should I use? Right? I always get that question. So I need to work on one, because I can a little money. But it's a really interesting question, and I think in specific fields, at least in my field, the translator has become very important.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that in theatre, there is a long tradition of making the translator's name very visible. And of course, that visible name is usually a translator who is also a theatre person. And quite often they translate from languages they don't know. Christopher Hampton is one of my favorite bugbears, because we were together at Oxford many centuries ago. And I know he did a degree in French and Russian, and he does not speak Norwegian, but he's translated Ibsen. And of course, what he does is use a plain prose translation and then rewrite it as a Christopher Hampton play in English, and it works very well, and it's fine. But he gets all that big credit up there, translated by Christopher Hampton. We translators who actually know the languages we work from get a little bit miffed about that. However, that's special to the theatre, or rather, special. The theatre translation is a world of its own, and it works in its own way. Especially because even the translator's work gets, well, some might say mangled, others would say improved by the director, the dramaturg, the actors, and then they forget their lines and say something different anyway. So it is a thing. I mean, for book translation, there are only a few instances where the name of the translator is as it were, more visible, has visible over that of the author. In poetry translation, especially retranslations of the classics, then it's the translator's name that is highly visible, yeah, like Emily Wilson these days, or Seamus Heaney. Okay, so in poetry translation, theatre translation, the translator is visible. In fiction translation, less so. But to answer another question I see on the chat as part of this answer, Kadare's novel about the bust-up between Albania and the Soviet Union in 1960, the novel that is called Le Grand Hiver in its first edition in French, L'Hiver de la Grande Solitude in its second edition in French, and which, for reasons I'm not going to explain now, will or would be called The Winter of Our Discontent if it were ever translated into English. That is the one big Cadare novel that I think really deserves to come into English. But it's one of his biggies. It's nearly 500 pages long. And that is about translation. It is the story of the team of 4 translators that Hoxha took with him to Moscow for the big meeting, the 81 communist parties of the world, and at the end of which Hoxha just walked out and cut off relations. And it's about the difficulties of translation, the tensions of translation, the sheer terror of using the wrong word, etc. And it is actually based on Kadare's own interviews with the actual translators who were there in Moscow. So there we have an answer to the question, what should be translated, how to foreground translation by writing a novel about translators, and the question of the visibility of translation. Okay, stop there.
I think we have time for one last question. This is from Kelly. Why do you think that Kadare is so drawn to using Greek mythology in his works and continually relates it to Albania?
I mean, isn't that like I feel like those are probably like his favorite works that he's like really poured over, right, in some ways, and really kind of carefully explored very closely in ways that perhaps less so the more sort of contemporary works. I don't know, I always found that there was a vibe, at least in the Palace of Dreams, that, that there's just something about, there's some kind of the sort of aesthetic of ancient Greek kind of tragedy is something that he's really drawn to because of the sort of contained, the poetics of containment and the sort of restraint, and that, I don't know, seems to be.
It's also a very important part of the identity of Albania, as he wants to underline. These myths belong to that era, and we, meaning we Greeks, or we Arberos, or we Balkan people, but I think particularly Albania, he's often argued that whereas maybe Greece went in certain directions, that we are the actual inheritors of these epics. We still have them in the Geg epics. So that there is that, I think, which is important. I will say there's a little bit of in Greece, Cadare is highly esteemed. As I mentioned last week, to Emily's class, in an iPhone, if you say I'm translating Cadare, if you dictate it in a WhatsApp message, it'll come out garbled in English. If you say it in Greek, Cadare is understood by the iPhone, it'll come out as Cadare. So he is part of also, it goes both ways. But I think that probably, I wanted to bring that up, Ani, to add to what you were saying, because I think that is rather important to him in much of his writing.
Yeah, I think you're really right. I think the nationalist, I don't know that it's competition. I think there's just a kind of greatness that he associates with Greek tragedy, and that, he thinks Albanians were doing this too, maybe even before. I mean, maybe before. I don't know.
Yeah, I think influence is not the right conceptual tool. You could call it, perhaps more accurately, you call it appropriation. I mean, the Greek myths were written in Greek, but they should be in Albanian because we were there first. So they can't be, because you can't fabricate a 3,000-year-old manuscript, but you can jolly well write a novel now that, as it were, re-energizes those stories and shows the way in which they mean in Albanian. That there is something of that, of the Albanian national myth of priority, of historical priority, but also the fact that Cadare comes from Gjirokastra, which is virtually on the Greek border. Greek is spoken all around Gjirokastra, and the river that separates Albania from Greece, at least, you know, the border is still not completely settled by international treaty, incidentally. It's still a not hotly disputed, but a mildly disputed line. That line is the river called Acheron. I mean, it's actually, it has the name of that river that separates the living from the dead in ancient Greek mythology. And Cadare is well aware of this. He grew up there. He comes from Greek mythland.
Thank you so much for a wonderful panel. I know that we left a few questions unanswered at the very end. You can use the contact tools on the conference website, the festival website, if you'd like to contact the speakers directly. I'm going to turn the mic over to Carrie now for a few last words of transition.
Thank you so much, Emily, and all of our panelists. That was a fascinating conversation. I do want to take just a quick moment to thank all of the event sponsors you see displayed on your screen. With that, thank you again.